conflicts and veterans of no conflicts, or people that served in our great military. 1995, I was at a investment conference with my dad. He introduced me to a guy named Gary Mastronato. We became lifelong friends. He was in our business. And about 10 years ago, when my father died, he got up and spoke at my dad's funeral. He said, you know, when I met Joe Leonard, my father, Joe Leonard, he said, I realized this man was the real deal. He was authentic. He was a man's man. And then when I met his son, I realized he was just a cheap imitation. And sometimes I do feel like a cheap imitation. I will say that that World War II generation was a great generation. I don't know if they were the greatest generation, and I'll tell you why. Because I think the people that were called on in Korea and in Vietnam, and then in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq, I think there's some pretty great generations also. I think anytime a generation is called upon to do something to defend the nation and put their own lives at risk, it's a pretty damn great generation. 9/11, my father and I were sitting in our office down the street, and he was watching on the TV set. Keep thinking I'll get through this every year without breaking down. And I saw tears come out of his eyes. And he said, how is this possible? He was looking at the TV, and the second plate has just gone into 2 World Trade Center. And he said, how is this possible? 2 times in my life that my country has been caught so unaware. But it did happen. My dad arrived in Hawaii on the big island of Oahu in about late October, early November of 1941. He was in the 34th U.S. Combat Engineers, which became the 1341st U.S. Combat Engineers during the war. He said it was a really great job in a way because it was just like a construction job. And you went to work and you came home. Came back to the barracks, rather. He did underwater demolition, so he had a little bit in common with the early frogmen in the Navy. And he liked demolition. He said, I like blowing things up, and it was pretty fun. He was stationed in Schofield Barracks, and on the morning of December 7th, as you may remember, it was a Sunday morning, about 7:55 local time, and the first of multiple squadrons of Japanese fighter planes called Zeros came in from the back of the island over the mountains, and they were coming to knock out the 2 airship fields, which were Hickam Field and Wheeler Field. And as they came over there, they went over his barracks, Schofield Barracks, and the first bullet to be received over the urinal, bringing America both into World War II and into the Battle of the Pacific, hit right over the urinal in his barracks. He was not at the urinal at the time. As a matter of fact, he was not even in the barracks at the time. He was on detached assignment at a place called Fort DeRussy. And he said, unfortunately, he had an incredible view of what was going on as it was happening. Several times he was asked, they said, Joe, what were you doing when the bombs were falling? And he would always think for a minute, and he said, hiding. Hiding under a bulldozer, which is probably where I would have been, hiding under a bulldozer. But it was interesting to see the battle through his eyes. I'll never forget, we went, to the movie Pearl Harbor, and he had his Pearl Harbor cap on, and we came out of the movie, and everybody wanted, to get around him and talk to him. My dad was a character. I remember him telling me one time, and his father was on the police force here in Lincolnton. He went AWOL because he didn't think he should have to do KP one weekend. And his sergeant said, Leonard, you live down with those backwoods people down in North Carolina. You think you could get me some white lightning, some moonshine, some homemade liquor? My dad said, yeah, probably could. So on the way back from being AWOL, he had a case of pint jars of moonshine in the back of his car. And he had the key to the trunk in his shoe. And he was stopped by a patrolman, and he said, I want to see what's in your trunk. My dad said, the trunk doesn't work. And he said, well, the ticket's going to be whatever it was, $20. My dad said, what if I was to tell you I don't have $20? And the officer said, well, I just take you to jail. My dad said, I'd just about soon go back to jail as I would back to the Army. And this is before he went to Pearl Harbor. I said, Dad, you were negotiating with a police officer. You just crossed state lines with a case of illegal alcohol in the back of your trunk. He said, yeah, it wasn't very smart, was it? I said, no. So we got back, and the sergeant said, I have to punish you. So they made him dig a hole after he got his alcohol. And about 5 minutes later, the sergeant said, that's good. So there's always a story. You hear things out of a book, but then you see the story. My dad didn't talk about the attack too much, except a couple of things I do remember, that as the attack was in process, there was a squadron of unarmed American B-52 bombers that had come from the States, from the LA area, and they were not rigged with any type of gunnery. They were just coming in cold, and they hit right in the middle of the attack. So they had to ditch all of the planes in the ocean. I thought that was interesting. He said another thing that I've always stuck in my mind is on that morning there was a group of people from the combat engineers, and they were up on top of the officers, I forget what you call it, where the officers go to have a good time. And they were up there and they were hammering and nailing. It was early on Sunday morning. Most everybody was asleep. And these squadrons of Japanese Zeros started coming in. They were waving at them like, hello, thinking they were our planes. And all of a sudden, they started peeling off in formation and started, machine gunning or strafing these people. And he said it was all a different deal then. But my dad was very upset on 9/11 that he could have lived through this process 2 times in a row. My grandmother and grandfather, about several weeks after Pearl Harbor, received a box from the Army, and it had all of his belongings. My aunt came home one day, and my grandparents were crying, and she said, what's the matter? And they said, we just received all of Joe's belongings. So naturally they thought he had been killed, but he was just sending back some of his belongings. Later in the war, my dad was on the island of Oahu for 3 years, about 3 years after the attack. And he also spent time on the Pacific islands of Kwajalein, Saipan, and Tinian. And on the Pacific island of Tinian, he helped to build the runway that the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, took off and bombed Hiroshima in Japan. So, pretty amazing. My dad was intimately involved at the very beginning of America's involvement in both World War II and in the Pacific, and intimately involved at the end. And he was always proud to say that all of the ships and all of the aircraft carriers that took part into the attack on Pearl Harbor were sunk at the end of the war and at the bottom of the ocean. And he was proud of that, because he didn't think much of that attack. I came out of college in 1981, bought a TV and a VCR. It was made by the company Mitsubishi that had made the engine of the Japanese Zero that bombed him at Pearl Harbor. He wasn't amused. So I salute everybody that's been in our armed forces. As many people say, once you get past that, if you can just get out of it alive, the rest of it's gravy. I'm 60 years old, and all of my life has been gravy. I haven't had to put myself in harm's way. I remember going up to the post office and signing up for the draft in '75, but the fall of Hanoi happened before the draft continuing on, and Vietnam was all over. So I salute all of you that have ever worn the uniform, that there's a lot of people in a lot of great generations, not just the greatest generation. Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming out this morning.